Hello everyone, here's a little update on the cemetery situation as far as we were reading the narrative and their excuse for founding or establishing Elmwood Cemetery was that Kansas City's first cemeteries um, ran out of room due to the cholera outbreak, etc. But in a comment from New West Reset, he was asking about one of the first cemeteries, so I figured I'd do a little search here. And I came up with this article on Martin City and South KC Telegraph, and this is from 2019. And first of all, take a gander at this structure right here. You know, when I first found this, I'm like, what is going on here? Well, we're going to get to that in just a second, but so two former cemeteries tell a story of Kansas City's past. Two cemeteries in what is now Kansas City's once acted as public burial grounds for the area's first residents. Both have been erased from history. So, before we get to the main one that we're going to talk about, which is referred to as the City Cemetery, I'm going to read a few lines off of what they tell us about this old Westport cemetery here. Also called Indian Cemetery or Yoakum Cemetery, the old Westport Cemetery was established as a public burial ground in 1835 on land donated by Westport merchant Edgar Price. Leading citizens, Native Americans, victims of the cholera outbreak, and those who did not make it to their final destination while traveling on the Santa Fe Trail were all interred inside 1 acre plot of land at current-day Archibald and Pennsylvania streets. So they go on to talk about a few Revolutionary War and war stuff here. And then we're gonna scroll down here. In 1915, Badger Lumber Company bought the old cemetery land and began construction of their new administrative building. They erased away the remaining graves and graded the bones deep into the earth. According to the Kansas City Times, colorful descriptions graced the headstones of some of those interred at Westport Cemetery, including one headstone for a Jerome H. Glanville, whose stone said he was murdered by 4 Yankee abolitionists at Bull Creek. These stones quickly disappeared from the land as their 3-story building was erected. They have not been located. One headstone miraculously did survive the destruction of Westport Cemetery, the Kansas City Times reported. When the ground was being cleared, Badger Lumber Company officials decided to utilize one of the oldest gravestones in the cemetery as a cornerstone of the building. As morbid as it is, Lieutenant Boggs' partial headstone worn away, only bearing his name and died January 22nd, 1843, was embedded high up in the brick plaster of the building. 1 year later, a local DAR chapter put an additional marker below Boggs's headstone. And And then this over here says Lieutenant Boggs' headstone is viewed at Union Cemetery today. The original stone is cemented in the ground. So we go on, they talk about this Badger Lumber Company. In 1965, the Badger Lumber Company building was razed, but not before the DAR ensured that Lieutenant Boggs' headstone wasn't lost again amongst the demolition. They removed his partial headstone and erected a new one at Union Cemetery. So, what is going on here? They erased this cemetery. When was this? In 1915, Badger Lumber bought this cemetery and, plowed all these bodies or whatever all into the ground and built their building. 1915. And then what? It was torn down in 1965? But it sounds like they were tearing the building down and then they rescued Lieutenant Boggs' headstone once again. So what's really going on here? What happened to the other bodies and headstones not removed by family members is unknown. Oh, by the way, and I'm just skimming this, but I read it earlier. I think the families were required, or they had to pay out of pocket to have their loved ones' bodies exhumed and moved. So, obviously, some of them did not. Then we got this little cartoon down here with this grave marker on the side of this structure. And now we're going to get to the city cemetery in the town of Kansas. After its founding in 1838, the town of Kansas slowly grew from the vision of its 14 original founders. John McCoy wrote, "When the town site of Kansas City was first platted, the square plot of the land was dedicated by its owners as a public cemetery." Found between Independence Avenue to the north of 6th Street to the south and in between Oak and Locust Streets, the city cemetery was set aside as the first public burial ground. Starting in 1845, the city cemetery was the final resting place of some of Kansas City's founders. One person buried there was William Miles Chick, a native of Virginia and one of the first permanent residents of Kansas City. He was the city's first merchant and the city's first postmaster. A large cholera outbreak in 1849 had the cemeteries filling up quickly, and space was a problem. McCoy recalled that people knew even by 1855 that graves would need to be removed. The city cemetery was then closed to more burials in 1857, but the graves remained untouched for a time. But the city planners had other ideas for this town's first public burial ground, as the hills around it were being graded for easier access. In 1866, city officials published a public notice in Kansas City Journal notifying all buried at the city cemetery would need to be removed at the family's expense. Who writes this crap? It's such a freaking tongue twister all the time. A large number of people replied to the orders, but others were not as lucky, as families may have left the area and others couldn't locate the graves. Sounding like the story we were reading above. By the early 1870s, grading began along the roads that passed by the graveyard. Leveling was completed by prisoners of the city workhouse. Oh, so our boys over here from the city workhouse castle, they dedicated some of their time to do a little bit of regrading and leveling of the streets over here. As one could only predict, there was a problem immediately as the cemetery was chiseled away foot by foot. A large number of body parts and coffins were exposed. One worker testified that he took down 19 graves and 8 of those were thrown into a pond on the east side of the location. Only the larger bones were put into boxes. He recalled even seeing dogs carrying away the bones that hadn't been taken care of. Those are some good doggies. The rain began to cause issues, of course, graves and bodies and hair and everything's just sticking out of the ground everywhere. A local man was then commissioned to build boxes about 3 feet long and 1 foot deep to hold the remains that were found. As many as 5 skulls were put into each small, cheap, rough box and buried once again. On and on we go about body parts and fragments of body parts and coffins and animals running off with the remains. The site of Kansas City's first public burial ground became the city's first park, named Shelley Park, after Mayor George Shelley. The spot became the front lawn of the second courthouse, built at 5th and Oak in 1887. Further advancements in Kansas City now has the site of the first public cemetery and the first public park, now under Cloverleaf Highway access, both erased from view. So, okay. Where do I even begin here? Kansas City isn't that old at this point in time here. And we are already on our second courthouse? Is that... Let me read this here again. The land just to the south of the second courthouse at 5th and Oak is the site of the first city cemetery. And I'm not really sure what they're referring to here. I'm assuming that this building here is Kansas City's second courthouse after, being founded in the 1830s, and we aren't even out of the 1800s yet here, and we're on our second courthouse. And this place just looking completely built out. Obviously, something, the background looks all smoky and hazy. I guarantee it's just as built out over here. This looks almost like a river. And it might be. I'm not real sure. 5th and Oak is downtown. So, I'll have to look into this a little bit more. So here we are downtown here. This is 5th and Oak right here. And I was right. This is the Missouri River behind it here. And also here's what they were referring to as the Cloverleaf little highway on-off ramp thing. I think it's been altered. It used to have 4 leaves. And it appears that's the end of this. Learning from the past, yes. I hope that answers the question as to what the hell happened to the first cemeteries. Well, according to them, they were erased from HisssStory and replaced with another story. But anyways, at the very least, I hope you guys found this a little bit entertaining. And thanks again for your time. I will see you on the next one.